All righty. Hello, everybody. Happy Monday morning, July the 6th for History 101, World Civ 101. I know that YouTube is very weird lately about not posting the links for upcoming shows. They're supposed to. I set them up to do that. But for whatever reason, they don't do it. So I'm going to go ahead and post the link now. Bear with me here just a second so that hopefully everybody, I have it in my computer. So I can just go to 101 and I can say create announcement. Link for today's video class session, and I post it in there. In fact, I'll go ahead and send an email of that immediately. There you go. All right, so now let me get back to you. There you are. Okay, so I believe the way it works is that, sorry, I get hot coming down here. I believe the way it works is if you subscribe to this channel, then you get the updated notice that the show's going up. But when I look on our video page and I refresh it, I see the, oh, there they go. Okay, yeah, okay. So this one is up there now. Let me look and see if all three for today are. No, just July 6th. I don't understand it, but I wonder if you guys will bear with me just one more second. Well, I can't do it now because we're in the studio. Okay, well, anyway, I think when I went and got the link to post it on Blackboard for you just now, that kind of like made YouTube display the link. So if you go to our video page now, which you don't have to because you're already there, but if other people do, they should see it. Yeah, it says live now. Okay, well, anyway, technical stuff. Good grief. All right, well, obviously the first big thing is that we've got the second test coming up. I'm going to look really quick and see what the situation is. Let me see. I'm going to make a note that your papers are turned in and I see them. So I can go and get those graded. So I'll start getting those back to you this week. I see quite a few of them there. In fact, them all up. Yeah, just most everybody's there, more or less. There's a few missing. It looks like the same folks that have done the first exam have also done the paper. Every one of them. It's a one-to-one relationship. So I guess there are a few people in the class that are still registered for the class, but are probably no longer thinking they're taking the class. So they haven't done the test or the paper. That'll sort itself out. But it looks like everybody who took the first test has also turned in the paper. And that's awesome. Very good. All right. So you've got your first test grade. Now our attention turns to, let me find you again. I got like 50 tabs open. There you are. Now our attention turns to the second test coming up. And I'm sorry all this stuff is so crammed together, but the summer, it's an 8-week class. So we do everything in half the amount of time that we do in a normal fall or spring semester. So what that means is we've immediately got the second exam coming up because we're at the halfway point. This is our fourth Monday together out of 8. So later this afternoon, give me a few minutes to get the last touches on it after I finish my last video class at noon. Okay. So I'll wrap things up at noon. Then I'll go in, put the final touches on the exam and upload it. So by the middle of this afternoon at the latest, because my office hours are 1 to 4. So sometime between 1 and 4, I will have exam 2 up on Blackboard. And it will be available to you to take, just like last time, for a week. Okay, so you'll have the whole rest of today. You'll have the whole rest of this week. You'll have the weekend. And you'll have Monday. So until like midnight a week from today. Okay. So, and as always, once you start it, you need to finish it. So make sure you are prepared. I'm sorry. I'm just, man, still hot, sweaty. Yuck. Make sure you have enough time to finish it. This is a longer test. This is the midterm. Now, in terms of the material it covers, this test will only cover part 2, right? So if I remember correctly here, that means this one covers O2 classical societies, which started with like the Persians, remember? And then it had the Greeks. And then we looked at the Roman Republic up through Octavian becoming Augustus. Okay. So that is exam 2. We had just done this exam right before the virus caused us all to go home in the spring. So I do not have an online version of this test. I'm just going to take the standard version, tweak it a little bit, and fit it into Blackboard format. It'll take me just a short amount of time, and then you'll be all set to go, which means if it works properly, it will have one essay question where I'll have a place, presumably I'll have a place where you can just type, 2 or 3 paragraphs at most of your answer. When I do an essay question, what I'm looking for is specifics. Don't blah, 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 blah. Put specific. My essay questions usually have several aspects to them. It'll be like a series of like 3 or 4 questions that together make up one topic. So for example, in the U.S. at War military history class, my essay question might be something like, what were the 2 or 3 main reasons the U.S. went to war in Vietnam? What was the main reason we didn't have complete success there? And, give an example of one of the leaders who didn't, achieve what he wanted to achieve or something like that. In other words, I'll have 2 or 3 questions within the question. So be specific and include, names or whatever. Dates are never a huge thing. I've always said, knowing dates in history is important to understand the context, but I never make, as you've noticed so far, right? I never make the answer to a question a date. I mean, that just seems silly to me. So I'll never ask you what year or what day did something happen. I might say when something happened in this year, who was responsible, something like that. Okay. So if I can get that to work, there'll be one essay question on it. I might give you like 2 or 3 options and you pick the one you like the best. But there'll only be one that you actually have to answer. And if I can't get it to work, then you'll just have extra multiple choice questions to make up for it. But it will be a longer test one way or the other, probably on the order of at least 40 or 50 multiple choice questions and then the essay. Okay. All right. So today we've got to talk about the Roman Empire. And by the way, if you've sent me an email in the last couple of days, I didn't get on email over the weekend. I was trying to be very diligent last week during the week about checking every day and replying to everybody. But if you're waiting to hear back from me over the weekend, I will jump on that this afternoon. Okay, I'll be working on this, putting up your second test for you this afternoon, and I'll be checking your emails. So if you need to contact me about that, by all means do. The classic question from Stephen about a study guide. As I always try to explain, you're reading your textbook. You normally would have everything I talk about in class. You have all of that. But then when I go through the PowerPoints, that is your study guide, because every single question on your exam comes directly, specifically off the PowerPoints. So if you just took the PowerPoints and changed them into like a Word document, that would be the study guide. That's how I do it. No professor I ever had in my 13 years of college ever gave me a study guide, and so I've just never done it either. Just look at the PowerPoints. That is your study guide. That will tell you exactly what is on the test. All right, let's look at if I can find my PowerPoints here. Let's look at the Roman Empire. That's not the one I want. World Civ 1. Okay, so we're in 04, the Roman Empire today. Share the screen, pick the right screen, and there we go. Okay. All right, so again, I continue to use the actors from the HBO series because it was relatively accurate for HBO. And I like the look of the actors that they found to play the various parts. This would be Octavian, who grows up to be Caesar Augustus. And in 27 BC, he actually straddles the BC AD divide, Octavian to Augustus. So he has a lot of names at this point, right? He is Octavian was his actual name. He is Caesar because he was the heir to Julius Caesar. It becomes a title, basically. In fact, the name Caesar becomes such a title, meaning like emperor or king or whatever, that the Germans take that name and make it Kaiser for their ruler for many years. And the Russians take the name and make it Tsar, up until 1917. So Caesar, Tsar, and Kaiser all kind of come from the same root, which is what Julius Caesar and Caesar Octavian Augustus. He also, by the way, the 8th month of the year is August, named after him, which is also Octavian. Oct is 8. Now you might say, wait a minute, I thought Oct would relate to October. No, the months are all screwed up. We talk about this in history. It comes up in history of religion that the months are all screwed up because Sept means 7, and yet September is the 9th month. Oct means 8, like an octopus or an octagon, and yet October is the 10th month. Neuf means 9, and yet November is the 11th month. And DEC means 10, like decade, and yet it is the 12th month. So the months are all kind of messed up, but at least it works out that Augustus Octavian is in the 8th month. So there you go. All right, moving along. He was given semi-divine status. That means they worshiped him like a god. And he is the first real Roman emperor in the sense that Julius Caesar was really just sort of a political dictator as opposed to actual royalty, right? Whereas he's the first one to be considered like royalty and like almost a god. He reigns for 45 years, about half on each side of the BC AD divide, fundamentally alters the Roman government into irrevocably an empire and no longer a republic. The Senate is just kind of like a rubber stamp at that point going forward. But he did include the elites. You remember Julius Caesar had kind of like backed away from them, feeling like they were kind of the problem. Whereas he includes them to pacify them and kind of tries to pull them all together. And so he creates the Roman Empire, which had a stable government for 2 or 3 more centuries. They have their highs and lows, as we'll see. And so this is the Roman Empire at its height. This is as big as it ever would get. Again, they include up to this point all the way up to the borders of Scotland. I always say, they conquered Britain and Wales here, and they got all the way up to Scotland, and they looked out into the Highlands, and they saw the Scots running around with their blue paint and their skirts and eating sheep intestines. And the Romans said, let's just build a wall here. We don't really need those people in our empire. They're kind of scary. And so the Scots are free. We're free, I tell you. And so they also didn't really want anything to do with the Germans. They tried to conquer the German lands. And then there wasn't a Germany until 1871, but these were the German lands, the German tribes. And they tried a couple of times, but they just couldn't beat these big, nasty, hairy, barbarian, Germanic tribal people that were sort of the forefathers of the Vikings and the forefathers of the Germans and the forefathers of the Danes and all that. They just said, you know what, let's just leave the Rhine and the Danube River here as the frontier, and we'll just go on from there. Instead, let's turn our attention down to the Middle East and to North Africa. And so they make the Mediterranean Sea what they called a Roman lake. Let me check real quick, as I like to do, and make sure that this is all we're just going to cover the Roman Empire today. So this may not take our whole, and by the way, we will have the third test just on what we're covering today starting next week. I'm sorry it comes fast and furious, but there's only 3 after next week. There's only 3 to go. So, and you got one more paper. So we have to just cram everything in. So yeah, this time next week, your third exam will go up, which is about just what we're covering today. Okay, so quick look at Roman architecture. I just wanted to show you kind of what it looks like. Again, you can look at this at your leisure in the PowerPoints in Blackboard, but I'm just going to run through them and kind of explain, as I always do, what the significance is. The Pantheon, it's still there, this incredible building with a hole in the top, but the Romans loved domes. Well, remember, the Romans kind of invented the arch. And what is a dome but a 3-dimensional arch, where you take an arch and you just take it in a circle? You know, the principles that hold up an arch are the same as the principles that hold up a dome. You're just taking it in 3 dimensions. So they loved domes. They loved arches. They loved concrete. They figured out how to make concrete. There's an ancient painting of the inside with famous scholars all inside of it. It even uses the same approach. I think this is fascinating. If the Romans figured this out 2,000, 3,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, you want the ceiling of a dome to be lightweight so it doesn't weigh down on you. And so they hollowed out each of the squares, and it's really just the grid that holds it together. And if you go inside like a subway station, you'll see the roof is made exactly the same way so that it doesn't weigh so much. The Romans figured this out thousands of years ago, and we still do it today. The aqueducts, are also just a bunch of arches, right? All that is the Romans wanted to take water from over here and put the water over there. And so what did they have at their disposal? Concrete and arches. So they make concrete and brick arches that are still there, and the water flows along that top trough like a pipe. Interesting thing about it, when you have like metal pipes or PVC pipes, you can have pretty good water pressure in there, and it's not going to explode, right? You can pump some pretty good pressure into that pipe. But they didn't have pipes. They had it it was like a ditch, an elevated ditch. And so what the Romans did was they had to make the angle of those things so subtly perfect. Like if you made the aqueduct too much of an angle, that water is just going to come pouring down like a waterfall and all pile up at the bottom and overflow before it ever gets to the city. And if you make the level too flat, too horizontal, the water is going to stop flowing and just mill about there and then overflow the sides. They had to be so precise to make the angle such that the water would flow along it at an even rate and never pile up in one place and kind of overflow the sides. It's really remarkable what they did. Okay, so of course it was into this world of this new Roman Empire that we get Christianity. Christianity is as much a product of Rome as anything, because it's hard to imagine it's hard to imagine a set of circumstances where Christianity would have developed the way that it did without that arch enemy at first of Rome to be the antagonist, to be killing them, to be mistreating the Jews and then later the Christians and all that. So now I talk about the full depth of this story in the history of religion class in 286. And by the way, do be thinking about registering for fall. I noticed of my classes this fall, one of them is already getting pretty full, but the others, some of them still have plenty of room. So go on, take a look at that if you're planning on taking classes this fall. We're still not sure, I don't think, exactly how we're going to do them, which is getting kind of late in the game for that. But anyway, so Christianity comes along into this Roman world because Judea, Palestine, Israel, whatever you want to call it, the Holy Land, was part of the Roman Empire during these years. So Jesus was a Jew, but he was a Jew living in part of the Roman Empire. And that shaped everything about him and his contemporaries. So he was born. Now, this sounds weird, I know, but we're talking about history here, right? I'm not teaching Bible study. I'm teaching what we know in actual world history. Okay, it's the way I do the history of religion as well. It's an academic study. If you have, that's fine. If you have specific religious beliefs about Jesus or Muhammad or Buddha or whoever we're going to talk about over the rest of the course, that's fine. But in here, we're talking about history and like what we know as academics about history. So bear with me. This may be a slightly different interpretation than you've heard. I don't know. Maybe not. Okay. Maybe you haven't heard anything. Who knows? So you might say, well, wait a minute. If BC means before Christ, how was Jesus born 4 years before he was born? That's a pretty neat trick. You thought walking on water was a neat trick. But no, actually, what it means is that we think today that the years are numbered wrong. They're off by 4 years. So in other words, when hundreds of years ago, when they developed the BC and AD terminology and measurements, we think now that they missed it by 4 years. So the year 0 or the year 1 would actually be 4 BC if you looked at the numbering today. Okay. So in other words, instead of living from 1 to 33, Jesus lived from -4 to 29. Same amount of years, same years, we just numbered them wrong. Okay. In Bethlehem, which at the time was part of the Palestine or Judea part of, actually it was it was, okay. Well, here's another discrepancy to talk about really quickly. The Gospels say he was born in Bethlehem, which is a suburb of Jerusalem, because he had to go to Jerusalem for the census. History says, nah, he was probably born in Nazareth, because there was no census that year. And if there had been, why would you travel somewhere you don't live to be counted for the census? Okay. So again, there's a dispute between what we know in history and what the Bible or the Gospels or whatever tell us. Both have their legitimate purposes, but they don't always agree. The Gospels don't even agree with each other. So again, history of religion, we talk about that. Or Nazareth, don't really know. His family was definitely from Nazareth, controlled by the Romans. The Zealots, who he kind of fell in with. And see, here's a big example of what I'm talking about there's two different ways of interpreting it. We were having a discussion on social media the other day, some friends and I, and somehow Jesus came up and Jesus's purpose in Judea during that time. And I said, well, Jesus was basically in with the Zealots, and he died. He was executed by the Romans for political subversion, including disrupting the temple, overturning the money changers' tables, and freeing the animals, and basically causing a disruption that the Romans didn't like, because the Romans were like the cops and Jesus was like a protester. And one of the people said, no, that's completely 100% wrong. Jesus died to save our sins and to save the world, and to get God to save the world. And I'm like, whoa. You're talking about Jesus, the Son of God. I'm talking about historical Jesus. It's two different things. And they don't have to, they don't overlap always. So don't be offended either way. I'm not going to be offended if you throw a religious interpretation. Don't you be offended if I put a historical interpretation. That's my job. Okay. So the Zealots were the anti-Roman Jewish nationalists, and they believed that the prophets of the Old Testament had promised them a military commander, like a Rambo, like a General Patton, who was going to show up and kick Roman butt, right? So the most devout Jews, they hated what the Romans were doing in Palestine, in Jerusalem. Because the Romans were basically running the temple at that point. And so they were waiting for God to send them a champion who would destroy the Romans and drive the Romans out of their land. And so they were looking for a Messiah. That over 30 people claimed to be the Jewish Messiah during the time of Jesus. Over 30 different people. He was the only one that didn't have an army, by the way. It's kind of one of the reasons he stands out, in that way, is that he came about it in a completely different approach from the others, who were all military figures. He was saying things like turn the other cheek and love thy neighbor. And the others were all saying, I've got a bigger army. I'll go kill Romans. So yeah, they wanted a leader to defeat their enemies. Jesus takes this title, but he subverts what it actually means, which was very confusing, and which is why so many of the Jews of that time failed to join him, is because they didn't understand how a poverty-ridden, hand worker from Galilee was going to be General Patton, but that's not who he was claiming to be. So again, in History of Religion, we talk about this more. He was charged with blasphemy by the Jewish leaders, and he alarmed the Romans, and so the two of them together felt like he was a threat, and so the Jewish leaders and the Roman leaders together, including Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, got together, and they arrested him. They put him on trial. Now, it depends on which gospel you read as to how Pilate reacted. The gospels that were written more for the Jews say that Pilate was a horrible jerk and he was all responsible. But the gospels that were written more for the Romans say that Pilate washed his hands of it and said, this man is innocent, right? So, the gospels disagree about a lot of things. And one of the things the gospels disagree about is the nature of Pilate, because it depends on who the audience was supposed to be. The Romans didn't want to read a gospel about Jesus that said that one of the Romans was the bad guy. They wanted the Jews to be the bad guys. And the Jews didn't want to read a gospel of Jesus where the Jews were the bad guys. It had to be the Roman governor that was the bad guy. So you have two sets of bad guys depending on who was the audience for the writing. But in any case, he's put on trial. And as I said, between the Jews and the Romans, they condemn him, and he is crucified. 33 AD, I put question mark because, again, it was probably 29, but it just depends on how you look at it. And the disciples that went on beyond him, and again, we're not looking at there's the resurrection and all that, and that's fine, but that's religion. I'm talking about history. That I can't speak to resurrection. That's not something history speaks to, okay? But the disciples go on spreading his teachings and stories, and Christianity emerges out of this. I mean, you can imagine how appealing his message was, though, right? I mean, you've had all these other Jewish leaders saying, kill the Romans, purify the second temple, drive the foreign enemy out of our land. And then here comes a guy that says, the meek shall inherit the earth, right? It's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Love thy neighbor, love thy enemy, turn the other cheek, right? Jesus's message was a message of empowerment to the poorest and the weakest. So if you were poor and weak, and that was like 90% of the Roman Empire, right, then you found Jesus's message enormously appealing. But if you were a Jewish zealot wanting to kill Romans, you found Jesus's message very disappointing because he didn't say, go out and kill a Roman, and I'll help you. Here, I have a machine gun or something. That just wasn't Jesus. So Christianity emerges, but it first emerges as a sect of Jews. In other words, to be a Christian in the first century AD, you had to be 100% a Jew and then add on Jesus. You had to be 100% Jewish, and then Jesus was like an add-on. Okay, so he was the Jewish Messiah. And for many years, the only way to be a Christian was to be a Jew who also believes the Messiah has come, and it was that Jesus guy, as opposed to one of those 30-something other guys. Eventually, though, his message is preached to the Gentiles, the non-Jews of the Roman Empire, and particularly the greatest of the missionaries who did this was Paul. So Paul was originally, I wonder why that should say Christians. It's I'm not going to fool with it right now, but originally persecuted Christians. Okay. It's driving me crazy. I got to fix it. Sorry. There. I just can't stand it when a typo looking thing is on there. All right. So this is page 11. Get a move on. Okay, so Paul originally persecuted Christians. He was a Jew, but he was a Roman. And on the road to Damascus, the light shone down on him, and a voice said, Saul, his name was Saul of Tarsus, and a voice said, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? He said, who are you? He was blinded by the light. He couldn't see. He's like, who are you, Lord? He says, I am Jesus Christ that you've been persecuting. He tells him, go on to Damascus, and all will be revealed to you. And when he gets there, he becomes the greatest missionary in Christian history, and he travels throughout the Roman world because he was a Roman citizen. He was a Roman citizen. He could travel wherever he wanted, And he, instead of stamping out Christians, Paul spent the first few years of his life, as his professional life, killing Christians. But instead, he begins to spread the message of Christianity, including a few narrow escapes, like where he's lured by in a basket out the window, to the non-Jews. So the reason Paul is so important is that he traveled all over the Roman Empire, spreading the message of Christianity to people who were not already Jews. So Paul marks the break where you no longer had to be a Jew to be a Christian. You could go from pagan all the way to Christian without stopping in the middle to be a Jew. And this was very, very controversial. The early Christians who were Jews thought Paul was out of his mind. He writes letters, which are the bulk of the New Testament, more than half of the New Testament books, addressing various doctrinal issues, how you have a Christian church, how you be a Christian. He never met Jesus, by the way. He wasn't one of the original 12 disciples. He came along later. He sets Christianity up as a religion unto itself, not a part of Judaism anymore. And then we don't know what happened to him, but he traveled all over the Mediterranean world, creating Christian churches, which would be so important a bit later on, that there would be Christian churches all over the Eastern Roman Empire. And then finally, he's arrested and he's taken back to Rome because as a Roman citizen, he could demand that. And when he's in Rome, he is put on trial. And the last we know of him is a letter he wrote from a jail in Rome. And then he disappears. Presumably, he was executed in Rome for his promoting of this religion that was outlawed. And he becomes St. Paul, the real maker of Christianity as a world religion. So basically, there's three really critical people to the early beginnings of Christianity. We'll get to the third in a minute. But Jesus was the person whose ideas and he's the focus of the religion, obviously, right? And from a religious standpoint, he is the focus of the religion. From a historical standpoint, he gets the ideas out there and gets things going. Paul is number two because Paul takes what was a little tiny Jewish sect and transforms it into the dominant religion eventually of the entire European world, which is going to be so important to the modern world today. Okay, so Roman legacies, the Romanization of people across that whole area there. In Romanization, we mean civilized, able to travel freely and trade with one another. The architecture, the aqueducts, the domes, the Colosseum. They used an early form of concrete, domes, all that, and arch structures. Okay. And the aqueducts. And the roads. I forgot the roads, right? The Romans were so good at building roads that their roads are still there. They're the basis of a lot of the highways in Europe. And baths. The Romans were big on bathing, which later Europeans gave up as a really bad idea. The Romans had big public baths, and they bathed relatively often. And arenas, of course. They liked their entertainment. They liked gladiators. They liked people versus animals. They even filled up the Colosseum with water and had miniature naval battles. That's crazy. All right. Roman law was regular, lawful government across a whole vast area, right? So, in fact, Roman law was so successful and so influential that a number of countries today still use Roman law as the basis of their law. Many different ethnicities, many different backgrounds. The one thing they had in common was Roman law. Christianity breaks with Judaism in the first century going forward, retains many elements, but becomes a separate, distinct religion from Judaism. And it became impossible to be both, right? In other words, today you're either a Jew or a Christian. You can't really be a Jew and a Christian at the same time. Whereas, remember, in the first century, you could only be both at the same time if you were a Christian. You couldn't be a Christian by itself. Now you'd have to be one or the other. In 66 AD, there was a zealot Jewish uprising that actually succeeded in driving the Romans away for a few years. But the Romans can't stand being beaten. They hate it. So they regrouped and they came back in 70 AD and basically bulldozed Jerusalem. They slaughtered almost every man, woman, and child in Jerusalem to get back at revenge at the Jews for driving them out. They destroyed the second temple, the big temple that Herod had built up as such a great, housing of the Holy Spirit and all that. It was destroyed. It's still destroyed. It's not there anymore. And the Jewish diaspora happens. Diaspora means like a scattering of people. So the Jewish diasporas, when the Jews went from being just in Jerusalem, mainly in that area, Judea, to being all over the world. And they mainly back then went into Europe, went into the Roman Empire, some went into Russia, but they spread across Europe and into Asia. When the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, about 1,000 men, women, and children who were zealots, meaning very anti-Roman, fled into the desert to get away from the Romans, and they went to Masada, which was a Jewish stronghold up on this kind of like Stone Mountain in Georgia, this big rock up in the desert. And they fled to Masada, which King Herod had built up as a fortress and then kind of abandoned after his death. Okay, so here's what the second temple looked like. The second temple up on Temple Mount. Temple Mount was like this artificial, there was a hill there, and the Jews just kind of built a wall around the hill and then filled it all in, so it's a courtyard. So there's the second temple, we think, before it was destroyed. And then here is Masada. Ignore the Roman siege ramp for a minute. It's still there today. So the Jews went up on top of Masada. They had a wall all the way around the top. They had Herod's palace here full of dried food and stored water. So they could have lived there for years and years. But the Romans chased them into the desert, and the Romans built this ramp to attack them. Now, very quickly, the story of Masada, there's the mini-series ABC did. The story of Masada is that the Roman general Flavius Silva squared off against the Jewish leader Eleazar ben Yair. And the Romans built this ramp and brought up a huge battering ram with wheels, like you'd see in Lord of the Rings or Kingdom of Heaven, right? And they wheeled it up that ramp and attacked. And during the night, while they were waiting for the wall to come down, the Jewish leaders got together and said, when the Romans come in tomorrow, we can't fight them. They're going to kill all the men, enslave all the women, probably rape them, enslave all the children, and drag everybody off to Rome as souvenirs to show off how great they are and what happens when you stand up to the Roman Empire. And Eleazar said, there's not one among us zealots here that is so low as to deserve to be touched by one Roman soldier. So they said, we can't fight them. We can't run away. We're in the middle of the desert. And so they decided that they would all commit suicide. Now, this is not the happy ending that you want from this story, I know. But what he said was, if we run from them, they will catch us, and then all the bad stuff will happen. If we fight them, they will defeat us, they will capture us, and all the bad stuff will happen. Or we can take their victory from them, and they will remember us. And so when the Romans busted down the wall the next morning and went inside, they found all the zealots dead, and they had nothing. And the Roman general said, we've done all of this, and our only prize is a rock in the middle of the desert on the shore of a poisoned sea, the Dead Sea. So the Romans got nothing for all that trouble. Nothing. So it's a sad ending, but it shows how they were really willing to defy the Romans to the death. It's a pretty cool miniseries too. So the Christians didn't join that Jewish revolt, and so the Romans saw them more favorably and as a distinct group finally from the Jews. So the Romans for a little while are a little more favorable toward the Christians, but then things start, and during that time, while the Romans were okay with Christianity briefly, Christian ideas spread all over the European Roman world, and you get a Christian civilization growing amid the Roman Empire, which was officially pagan. It grew through a shared Greek language. In fact, the New Testament is written in Greek, not Hebrew, not Aramaic, Greek, because that was the lingua franca of the Eastern Roman Empire. Everybody spoke Greek. But then there was growing suspicion of the Christians because Christians encouraged common people to think of themselves as equal, and the Romans didn't like that. They didn't sacrifice to the emperor, the Christians didn't, and so they could be anybody, right? They kind of knew the Jews. Judaism is a religion, but being a Jew is also an ethnicity. Whereas anybody, black, white, Asian, anybody could be a Christian. And so the Romans were very suspicious of them, and they began to condemn them and feed them to the lions and all of that. The Roman frontiers by 117 AD, the time of, I believe, Hadrian, get to their greatest extent, or Trajan, get to their greatest extent. Yeah, Trajan. And the big threat to the east was Persia that we've already talked about, but they were kind of an empire that, remember, they rose and fell. To the north, of course, was the Germanic people. We already talked about those big barbarians. And then, of course, the Scottish barbarians were kind of a little thorn in the side up here, north of Hadrian's Wall. And there's Hadrian's Wall as it is today and what it looked like, where the Romans just didn't want to deal with the Scots. So they just built a wall to keep the Scots away. Being mostly Scottish, I think that's funny. So there it is. Okay. The limes, and that's not lines, it's limes. It's just a Greek word or a Latin word, were these long fortifications along these borders here that divided Latin Roman Europe from Germanic Europe. Okay, so basically here. The limes divide Germanic Europe from Latin Roman Europe. And Latin meant civilization, law, order, markets, and towns. Germanic meant Conan the Barbarian, illiteracy, barbarism. In fact, the word barbarian comes from, I think it was the Greeks that decided anybody that didn't speak Greek, it just sounded then like they were saying bar, 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 bar. So they said, oh, those are the barbarians. So barbarians. Okay, after 200 AD, the Roman Empire is besieged by pressures from outside. People migrating in massive numbers, pressing on the borders. A chain reaction going all the way back to the Mongols and the Chinese. So the Romans co-opt the barbarians at first. What does that mean? That means at first the Romans tell these barbarians on their border, we will let you into our empire if you agree to join our armies, our legions, and fight alongside us against other barbarians, right? We'll bring you in and make you privates in our army, and you help us fight the next wave of barbarians that comes along. Because I always say, migrations across Europe are like dominoes falling. They start out in like China and work their way east until eventually the last Germanic tribe gets pushed up against the Roman barriers. It's like if you're in a really tight concert room, you know, a chain hall or something, and somebody starts pushing from one side, the person that ultimately gets the brunt of it is the one up against the railing or the wall who gets, ugh. Well, that's what happened to the barbarians along the borders of Rome. These dominoes kept falling from the east, and the last ones got pushed up against Rome, and the Romans are like, look, we'll just induct you into our army, and you can help us. So the Goths and the Frankish people cross the Rhine and come into Western Europe, and they're never going to leave. Of course, the Franks are the forefathers of the French and others in Central and Western Europe. So there's war all across Europe. There's economic problems because Rome could no longer pay for all of this. You know, it's just like what we look at trying to pay for our armies all over the world today. So the barbarians start really crossing the lines and running everywhere. You got the Vandals running around spray painting everything. I'm just kidding. But the Vandals run around through here, the Franks, the Lombards, the Goths, the Huns, the Visigoths, right? They're all overwhelming the West. And in order to try to deal with this, the Roman Empire is divided. You got all these internal wars across the empire. It was just hard to administer such a vast area without telephones or telegraph or the internet. You know, you're basically trying to rule Europe on horseback. It's the fastest communications you have. So the Emperor Diocletian says, let's just divide the empire in half, and we'll have two different leaders that each can run half of it. That's just a little more convenient. So from the Danube to North Africa. So basically, right here, they just sort of chop the empire in half. And the interesting thing is the wealthier half is the East. We don't think of it that way, right? We're kind of programmed to think that, oh, Britain and France and Spain and Italy, that must be the rich half. The problem was the Western Roman Empire was up against the ocean. They didn't have anywhere to go to bring in wealth. Who are they going to trade with? They didn't know about Native Americans or anything. So the Western Romans were kind of like in a box. There was nowhere to go because of water or desert. The Eastern Romans were trading with Russia, trading with the Persians, trading with China, trading with the Arabs. So the Eastern part of the Roman Empire was making out much better than the Western. Okay, so there you see the line dividing it. And this was this was the wealthy part of the empire over here on the right, the East. This part was actually kind of getting run down. Somewhere along here in the coast of what is today Bosnia, used to be Yugoslavia, the Emperor Diocletian created this giant palace, this humongous palace. And this palace was so big, it's still there today. The Croatian city, not Bosnia, Croatia, the Croatian city of Split today includes that palace. Look at that. As part of their city. Places that were hallways in the palace are today city streets. That's that same as the palace back 2,000 years ago, and here it is today as part of the city. Isn't that crazy? There it is from above. You can really see it. That just blows my mind. All right, so a co-emperor was appointed to the west because the east was wealthier. The emperors became more Easternized, which means more Asianized, which back then really what it meant was the Eastern rulers in the East, in Asia, tended to be more god emperors, more absolute power. Governments in the West, like the France, Spain, Italy, Britain side of the empire, tended to have not democracy, but power was a little more spread out, right? They had a little more of a separation of powers in the West, which eventually would lead to the separation of church and state in the United States, right? America's political tradition comes out of this Western tradition of separation of powers and checks and balances. In the East, it was more dictatorship, one person with all the rule. So this is why in the West, you would have a pope as well as kings and emperors, so that you divide the religious and political power. In the East, you have a Roman emperor in what would be Constantinople, who has all political and all religious power all in one. It's like the Pope and the king was the same person in the East, just a different tradition. Almost divine authority, more power and splendor. And the person that kind of reflects this division and the way that the East goes separately from the West is the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great. Now, let me tell you his story very quickly. He was a contender to be a new emperor, but he had to defeat several other contenders to become the emperor. There was like a civil war. And on the night before the last major battle, where it's either going to be him or the other guy, their two armies are ready to fight, Constantine sees a vision where a light shines down from the sky in the form of this symbol here, which you may have seen in a church on the Chrismon tree at Christmas time. This is the symbol Chi Rho, which is, there are many different symbols for Christianity. There's the fish, there's the cross, there's also Chi Rho. And the reason this is a symbol for Christianity is that the Greeks didn't have CH, they had X. X was Chi, and it stood for CH. And the P was the R sound. So XP in Greek is CHR, the first three letters of Christ. That's a convoluted explanation, I know. But when you see XP, that literally means CHR or Christ. So Constantine saw it, and a voice said, "By this sign conquer." And he's like, why not? What have I got to lose? So all of his soldiers put Chi Rho, which is the equivalent today of putting a cross on their armor and their shields. And they go out and win the battle. He becomes emperor, and he owes a debt, he thinks, now to Christianity. Christianity helped him become emperor. So he slowly begins to convert, but in the meantime, he issues the Edict of Milan that let Christianity exist at all, right? It's now, remember I told you, had an up and down career Christianity did under the Romans. Sometimes it was okay, sometimes it wasn't. Well, now with the Edict of Milan, Constantine says, yes, you can be a Christian, it's okay. And Christians emerge from all over Europe. They come out of the woodwork. He begins making contributions to churches if they'll like put up a statue to him or credit him with being, the savior of Christianity now, basically. And eventually you get so many churches rising up that they're arguing with each other, and he begins to sit in judgment of their disputes over ecclesiastical means like their religious arguments. Like, is Jesus more man or more a God? Or is he kind of half man, half God? Or is he 3/4 man, 1/4 God? That's an ecclesiastical dispute. How do you interpret Christ? And so Constantine, when he was still a pagan, begins to be the judge of Christianity and decide what Christians believe. If you've ever heard the Apostles' Creed, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and Jesus Christ, his only Son. Okay, that comes from the Nicene Creed. And the Nicene Creed comes from the Council of Nicaea, where Constantine decided what the nature of Christ was. So isn't it fascinating that the thing that Christians state as their beliefs, that I just kind of spoke the beginning of for you, was actually written by a pagan in a city that is today in a Muslim country, Turkey. History is weird, y'all. That's the Nicene Creed, which later becomes the Apostles' Creed. In 321, Constantine makes Sunday a public holiday. He said, what day? We need a day of rest, the seventh day. Well, the seventh day is Saturday. Excuse me, the seventh day is Saturday. You can't have that. But on the first day of the week, Sunday, we worship the sun god, so it's Sunday. And the Christians said, well, look, 2 weeks ago you were slaughtering us and feeding us to lions, so we'll take whatever we can get. So yes, Sunday will work. So that's why Jews celebrate the Sabbath on Saturday, which is the seventh day, but Christians change it to the first day because the Romans wanted it that way. So he reunites the empire, converts on his deathbed, but he also, before he died, realized the eastern half of the empire was more important and it needs a new capital. So instead of the capital being in Rome, Constantine packs up the capital and moves it to this new location and builds a city that was named after him, Constantinople. A richer, more populated, better location. And there it is up close, Constantinople. Water on three sides, very well protected. There it is today. You can see this is where Turkey on European side touches Turkey on the Asian side. And that little horn there was Constantinople. Today, the Turks call it Istanbul, but it's the same city. This city was called Byzantium until Constantine took it over and made Constantinople out of it. And it would be a new capital that didn't have centuries of paganism like Rome did. And it would remain capital until 1453. There's a neat picture of it looking from the Black Sea. And there it is again. You can see the racetrack and the big church, the Hagia Sophia. So the most important things Constantine contributed, he established Christian Europe. Hard to minimize that. He joined Christianity together with the force of the empire so that the Roman Empire after Constantine would more often than not be a Christian empire. A Christian empire. Spread all over Europe. So this is why Jesus originated the religion. Paul spread it into Europe and made non-Jews able to be Christians. And then Constantine roots it firmly into the civilization of Europe. This is why Christianity goes from being a Middle Eastern religion to a European religion. See, it starts out as a religion of Jews in the Middle East, and then it becomes a religion of the Europeans, which is really fascinating, but it's not the only time this kind of thing happens. Remember, Buddhism started out as an Indian religion, and it moved to China, Japan, Korea, and left India behind. Not a lot of Christians in the Middle East anymore, right? But it is in Europe and the West. Through Alexander's old empire, that mud puddle I talked about all the time. But this further divided the East and the West into Catholic versus Eastern Orthodox because Constantine and Constantinople kind of made their own version of Christianity separate from what was going on in the West. And an economic division because the East had all that money and the West was isolated up against the Atlantic Ocean and declined. The Germanic tribes grew stronger there. And so finally, the West falls. They had relied too much on the barbarian mercenaries. They had decreased revenues. They had no new lands to conquer because they were up against the ocean. More barbarians came in from the east, the Huns and the Visigoths. And in 410, Rome itself, for the first time in history, was sacked by the Goths. And then the Vandals vandalized it. They lost their African lands where a lot of the food came from. And the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, what a great name, was killed by a barbarian king who was then recognized as the new Roman emperor by the Eastern Roman emperor. So that pretty much marks the end of the Western Roman Empire, because now a German barbarian, a predecessor to like Charlemagne, would be considered the Roman emperor. Okay. So that is going to be the third test. The third test will be just like the one you took last week. The third test will be 25 questions covering the Roman Empire only. Okay. So today, let's recap real quick. Today, starting probably around 2 o'clock, somewhere in there, I will have your midterm up for you. You'll have the whole 7 days to take it. And then we will, you'll see your grade on that over the course of the week. And then this time next week, I will post the third exam covering the Roman Empire. And then that means that starting with our material we cover here next Monday, which starts with Byzantium and Islam, everything from then on will be on your final exam. Remember, everything on an exam is just from the section we just covered or 2 or 3 before it. There's nothing comprehensive. All right. Well, I think that's going to do it for us. So you guys, good luck on your second test today. I will be grading your papers this week, and so you'll start seeing your grade popping up as this week goes by. And you should know a lot more in the next couple of days than you do now, grade-wise, which is awesome. And then third test a week from today. All right, so I'm going to get on out of here. Again, email me or let me know. Contact me if you want to talk to me, or one-on-one, or however you want to do it. Email seems to be working pretty well so far, but I'm always available. All right, guys, I'll see you guys later.